I love it when things run as smooth as butter. All right. For those at home and those who are watching, we're actually trying new software this morning. So, so it might not be, I don't know. Hopefully it works out well. If not, I apologize. We'll fix it next week. But anyway, I have confidence that it'll work. Not confidence in me or the software, it's in God. Living in New Jersey, we have, during the whole coronavirus thing, we were in lockdown and there's a lot of restrictions now. But thankfully, we're able to meet. We're able to gather. And this has been fantastic. It's been incredible. But there are some states where they're not able to gather. They're putting more restrictions, actually, even on some churches. And I mentioned last week that there was a petition or a statement that went out. I keep calling it a petition, but it's not. It was a statement that went out. And the statement was from Grace Community Church. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but it is from Grace Community Church. And by John MacArthur and the elders of Grace Community Church, they put out the statement. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. I don't know if you've, within circles, Facebook and all that, if you've heard what's going on. Well, Lynn was just reading to me this morning. Basically, John MacArthur is opening his doors this morning. And in about, 3 hours from now, because we're 3 hours ahead, opening his doors. They've been having service in the tent for a little while. He said once the restrictions kind of slowed down, the people just started popping back into the church. Even before the restrictions started slowing, they were doing live streaming. He said people were just walking in. They couldn't stop them. People just wanted to be in church. So finally, they kept doing more and more restrictions. President Trump came out, said, churches are essential. Let the churches open. Well, in California, they didn't allow the churches to open. Well, John MacArthur put out the statement last week, the Grace Community Church put out the statement last week, that they are opening their doors. This Sunday, they are opening their doors. They are doing live stream. They have the doors open because it's going to be like 110 degrees out there. And yeah, I get it. There's no humidity. It's a dry heat. But guess what? I've been in California. 110 is hot. It's hot. So they are opening up their doors so people can get into the air conditioning. Wear masks if you want to wear masks. They have masks there for them to put for people. They have hand sanitizer. They are also setting up a tent, which they've already had a tent outside, with a TV, and the campus is huge. So they have a TV out there, a screen out there. So if people don't want to go inside, if they're more comfortable outside, they can be in the open air and be in the tent. He's giving all kinds of options for people. Well, and he's not being shy about it either. He's not being shy about it. So Lynn just found this on Facebook this morning, and it says here, after Pastor John MacArthur announced that the congregation of Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, California, would be assembling in obedience to the Word of God, he received a letter from Los Angeles County government officials threatening repercussions such as fines and even possible arrest. It is sad how in a country that was pretty much founded on religious freedom, people aren't allowed to practice their religion the way that they believe their religion should be practiced. Especially when it comes to Christianity. We already knew that this was going to happen. We already know it's probably going to even get worse. But the one thing that I have to say about what they're doing at Grace Community Church, and I said that I signed that statement because I fully agree, and I'm glad that we're back. And when we had the church picnic, and I was bent on we are celebrating, and we are getting together as a church. It takes a lot of courage for a church the size of Grace Community Church to take a stand like this. A lot of courage. And it takes a lot of effort. John MacArthur has put a lot of effort. The elders have put a lot of effort into not only trying to open, but drafting the statement and also making it so that it's possible for people to be safe. And it's a lot. I mean, you got live stream, of open facility with air conditioning, an open facility with no air conditioning, just the wind and the hot 110 degree air. You got all kinds of stuff going on. And he's got every kind of opportunity there, so much effort and so much patience. Because you know what? Being confident in what God is doing and acting out in that faith, guess what? Now he has patience. Because he doesn't know what God's going to do. He doesn't know if standing there at the pulpit this morning, the police are going to show up in riot gear to go and arrest him. Oh, wait, no, shouldn't they be at the protest? No, I digress. Anyway, but no, I mean, he doesn't know what's going to happen. He's got to be patient with this and patient with God's timing and what God's going to do. And that's what happens when it comes to faith. You know, faith has these incredible markers on them. Faith is not just sitting around and waiting for God to do something. Faith takes courage, takes effort, and it takes patience. And that's what we're going to be seeing this morning as we look and we continue our study in Esther. We're going to be looking at confident faith is marked with courage, effort, and patience. Confident faith is marked with courage, effort, and patience. And we're going to see that in Esther chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Esther chapter 5. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 8 here. And the author of Esther writes, "Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on the royal throne in the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, 'What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even a half the kingdom it shall be given to you.' Esther said, 'If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him.' Then the king said, 'Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires.' So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, 'What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done.' So Esther replied, 'My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says.'" So our scene this morning changes from our scene last week. Last week, we saw Esther, who was in her own quarters, and Mordecai was outside the gate in sackcloth and ash. And he was mourning the fact that the Israelites were about to be murdered. There was about to be genocide. The entire nation of Israel was about to be wiped out. And so this morning, we are now going from outside of the palace. We're going from the queen's quarters to the royal throne room. And we find in verse 1, now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. I mean, you see here royal, you see king. It's used over and over and over again to demonstrate where she is going. And remember last week, she was concerned and worried that going in to go see the king unannounced was going to do what? It may cause her extinction. It may cause her to be put to death right there, then and there. And so her perception was, at the time, fear of man, fear of death, fear of perishing. But Mordecai, and Mordecai's words to her, when he said to her, how do you know you have been put in the palace for such a time as this? Changed her entire perspective. She was at that moment chasing after herself and trying to save herself until Mordecai had mentioned, how do you know that you weren't placed there? And the intention there is by God for such a time as this. And so now she's gone from trusting in herself and wanting to save herself to trusting in God instead, having faith in God. And so what she does at this point is she demonstrates this faith. She puts on the first marker of faith, which is the mark of courage. Confident faith is marked with courage. And it mentioned last night, isn't that redundant, confident faith? It sounds redundant, doesn't it? Well, isn't confidence faith, and isn't faith confidence? Here's what it is. Faith is trusting in God. That's faith. Faith is trusting in God, not knowing what the outcome is going to be. Confidence is acting on that faith and actually going out and doing it, not knowing what's going to happen, knowing that God is in control. That's the difference between the two. Faith is believing it. Confidence is knowing it and moving towards it. And courage is an incredible marker of faith. Because courage moves people, courage causes people to act. And sometimes act against their I don't want to say better judgment, but they move in their weaknesses. It's typically what courage does. In verse 1 here, Esther is demonstrating serious courage. I get this picture of Esther putting on her royal robes, which the picture that I'm getting is that she's not putting them on. She's got her maidens putting them on. Dolling her up, putting her crown on. And the whole time she's putting on the royal robes, she's sitting there and she is weak physically from not eating for 3 days. And her nerves are causing her to be trembling with this crazy feeling in the pit of her stomach, not knowing what the king is going to do when she enters those doors. And all that anticipation and all those nerves, as she walks up to that door, just start to continually build and build. Until finally she goes through that door and she just stands there. And it's probably out of respect for the king that she just stands there and she waits to be called on, but it's probably at the same time petrified, because she's petrified with fear, because she doesn't know what's going to happen. I understand this fear. I get this fear. Because the very first time I ever preached, I don't know if I've ever told this story. I know Lynn has told it numerous times, but the very first time I ever preached in preaching class, my homilies class, I was scared. I was so scared I couldn't sleep the night before. I was so scared I was going over the sermon in the car ride there, and I was freaking out. Lynn actually drove. She drove me there. She went to all my preaching classes while I was in college. And she was there for the first one. And I walked into the room, into the classroom, and I'm shaking. And then the professor, every time before we preached, he would always take us to this little alcove, and we go out to the little alcove, and we go and we pray. And I walked out there, he prayed for me. And I was still shaking like a leaf. And I went up he announced me, I went up and I preached. And I went up and it was, I think it was 15 minutes. And that was it. We were supposed to preach for 20. Not less than 20. I got marked down for that. But it was the scariest thing I ever did. I was petrified. Knees were shaking. Knuckles were white. I actually have this nervous thing, right? And he caught it. And this is exactly what it is. It's very obvious. And guess what? My finger could have gotten burned off by the amount of times that I turned this ring. It was insane. He actually said, he thought I was going to run out the door when we went out to go pray. That's how scared I was. That's Esther. All I had to do was preach in front of 5 people, I think it was. Not much different than now. But all I had to do was preach in front of 5 people. But she had to go before a king. And her life was on the line. My life wasn't on the line. And I can just picture her standing at that door. Teeth chattering, face pale white, knuckles probably all white, fists clenched, knees buckling, trembling from fear. It takes courage to stand on what you believe. It takes courage to confidently walk into a room, even though you're petrified, to do what you believe is what God wants. It's a serious amount of courage. And she's demonstrating it here. You know, I've read the passage at least twice this morning, but if I didn't read the passage, this would have been a great time for like a cliffhanger for me to like keep it going. Because you don't know what's going to happen, right? Well, we do, because I just read it. She doesn't know what's going to happen. King catches her eye. In verse 2. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So here we have Esther petrified. And I don't know if the king just looked at her and just remembered the radiance of her beauty, or if he saw her shaking and timid and had this moment of like, not fear, but concern, you know, and wanted to know what's going on, and he cared about her. I don't know how much he really loved her. It's been over 30 days since he's actually called her, and the intention with that is it called her to his bedroom. So, I mean, that's really what they were meaning by that. So they haven't seen each other for at least 30 days. And now she walks into the room, standing there petrified, scared. Remember, doing the opposite of what Vashti did. Vashti was called by the king to come into his presence, and she refused. This time, Esther hasn't been called by the king to come into his presence, and she walks into his presence, and he, in a sense, fawns over her. And I'm not sure why. Well, I know why, because God moved him to fawn over her, but what was it about her? Was it the fear? Was it the trembling? Was it her beauty? Well, we don't know. But the one thing is that her courage paid off, didn't it? Because he looked at her, and as petrified as she was, he extended the golden scepter to her. Basically saying, don't worry, your head's not getting cut off. And she honors that. She received respect from him, and she responds by respecting him back, by going over and touching the top of the scepter. It's the rest of verse 2. And then in verse 3, then the king said to her, what's troubling you? See, it was visible. Something was wrong. And he knew that something was wrong, not only because of the visible terror, but because she actually came in unannounced. So he knew something was up. What troubles you, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be given to you. So the king looks at her, sees that something's up, and wants to know what it is. And it's the whole exaggeration, the whole hyperbole, up to the half of the kingdom I'll give to you. Well, she's the queen. I mean, up to half the kingdom, it is hers. But anyway, he's saying that he'll listen to her. He wants to listen to what she has to say. He wants to know what's going on. So her courage brought her in there, confident in God's power and confident in God's control. You know, she couldn't see what was going to come up the pike. She didn't know, but she was confident that God had it in control. You know, there's countless examples in Scripture of people who are confident and have courage in God. And God, in Genesis, you know, he calls Noah. All right, you're Noah. Noah, I want you to build an ark. This world has gone topsy-turvy, and I'm going to destroy them all with a flood. I'll give you the instructions. You build it to my specifications. And you're going to take 2 of every kind of animal onto the ark, and you're going to take seven clean animals of this kind, 7 clean animals of that kind, 7 clean animals of that kind, so you can offer sacrifices. And you and your wife and your kids and your daughter-in-laws are all going to go. And you turn around and you look at Noah and you say, yeah, that sounds feasible. As far as we know, Noah would have had no idea what this would have constituted. A worldwide flood? A worldwide flood. I got to build an ark? Is this thing going to float? What does it mean to float? The landscape of the world is completely different in his time. You know, we look at the globe and we think, Oh, okay, yeah, Noah could have built the ark. We have no idea where Noah built the ark because we have no idea what the landscape of the earth was at that time. Was it all one continent? Was it not? Was he in the middle of the continent with no water around him except for the rivers? We have no clue. We don't know if those rivers were wide enough for them to even build a boat and take a boat. So we have no idea if he knows what an ark even is. But God turns around and tells him, build a boat. A massive boat. If you guys want to see a replica of it, go to Connecticut. Connecticut? I think it's Connecticut. Kentucky. That's it. I knew it started with a K. Yes, I know. So anyway, you can see the replica. It's actually built to size. It's gigantic. And here's Noah building it. And he builds the whole thing. And that takes a lot of courage. It really does. Especially when you're in a world of wicked people. And God must have protected him. I mean, these people, who knows what they would have been thinking? Who knows what they would have been saying to him? Who knows what his family was saying to him? God just says, no, you're righteous. You're the only righteous one. It doesn't say you're righteous, your wife is righteous, your sons are righteous. No, he brings them because they're his family. And God tells them to bring them so that they can start. But he's the righteous one. So what is his family even thinking? And come on, guys. What'd your wife think if you're sitting there building a big old boat? And you turn around and say, well, God told me to do it. Well, it takes a lot of courage. A lot of courage to trust what God says. And it takes a lot of confidence in God knowing that he's going to bring it about. Even if you've never seen water before. It takes confidence to know he's God, I'm not. He's going to do it, and I'm going to follow. And I know he's going to do it. It takes courage. And for you men, you remember Joshua 1, 5 through 9. What does God tell Joshua there in Joshua 1, 5 through 9? Be strong and courageous, for you will give these people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and courageous. Do according to the law Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. Here's Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man by all accounts, who's watched God bring Moses and the nation of Israel through the wilderness for 40 years, and he has now been charged to take the nation into Israel, into a land that's not his, that's already inhabited by other people who are warriors, and he's got to go in and take these they're actually young people. These are the children of those who were enslaved in Egypt. And he's got to take their kids into the promised land. And these kids, they haven't seen war. This is their first time going to be seeing war. And they've got to do all of this. They got to all act in confidence that God's going to bring it about. That's why God, in Joshua 1, chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, tells Joshua to be strong and courageous. But that's not strong and courageous on his own resilience. That's strong and courageous in God's power. Because God's the one that gives the people the land. God's the one that brings the people through. And Joshua has to have the courage to lead those people walking after God. And we all know how the nation treated Moses. Constantly fighting with him and constantly telling him no, and Moses kept on pushing and going forward. Well, the nation's going to do the same thing with Joshua, and he's going to have to continually remind them, no, we got to follow God. It takes courage to do that kind of stuff. It takes courage to follow after God, knowing that God is making a promise, but not knowing how he's going to bring it about. Esther had that courage. She trusted that the nation was going to be delivered. And because of Moses' wise words and cursing, breathing down a curse on her, not, foul language, but cursing her, she stepped up. She trusted that God was in control. And she realized God is doing something. So now she's doing something. She's taking courage and following after what God does. That's the first mark. The second mark is that it's marked with effort too. See, having courage does not mean sitting around and doing nothing. Having courage means you actually get up and do something. Sometimes you don't even have to go into a very difficult situation like this. But one thing that you definitely need is effort. Courage kind of brings on effort. Or effort brings on courage, whichever way you want to look at it. But look at this. In verses 4 through 6. Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Let me stop right there. You see her faith? See the effort that she's already put out? She went into this room. She took courage for her to go in there. But before she even went in there, guess what? Her servants are fast at work and have been fast at work preparing a glorious meal for the king. So she doesn't go in there to ask if he could just, I'd like to prepare a meal for you. No, I'm preparing a meal and I'd like you to come have a meal with me. She puts effort into it. Oftentimes, and this is really what faith is. Her faith actually did not begin with her courage. Her faith did not begin with preparing this meal. You know when her faith began? When she put the effort into prayer. That's when her faith began. When she was fasting at the end of chapter 4, in verses 15 through 17, when it says here, "Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, 'Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish.'" You see, that's where it began. And that's where real effort in faith begins. Prayer. It begins with coming to God. It begins with seeking Him out. And it's not seeking Him out for your own desire. All right? It's not seeking Him out so that He will give you what you want. It's seeking Him out so you can align yourself with His will. That's what prayer is all about. That's the effort that we need to take when it comes to faith. It's trusting in who God is and what God will do. For those who don't know, on Sunday, Lynn and I went and dropped her car off at the mechanic. And so we dropped off the car at the mechanic, and then Monday, I took Lynn to Harvey Cedars in the morning, and I was going to go back in the afternoon to go hang a soundboard and do some stuff over there. And so I dropped her off, brought the van back here, and I around 2:30 or whatever, I was go and get ready to leave, and go start the car, and it starts a little funny, but it started. So I came back in, let it warm up, I went back out, got in, put it in gear, and it went from where Bashir's car is to where it's parked right now because it died completely. Just stopped. Like the gas just wasn't getting to the engine. So what did we do? Well, we put together a plan. We figured something out. We put some effort into things. You know, the one thing we didn't do is we didn't stop. And, you know, I prayed that God would just put everything together and do what he's going to do. But you know, what's people's first reaction? Pray for a different vehicle. You know, try and figure out a different way. You know, go across the street and take the guy's Dodge Ram 1500. I mean, that's not what you do. You just trust that God's going to put it together, and you put in some effort. We rented a vehicle for a couple of days, and we called out, got a ride, and got to go get the vehicle, and you know what? And God worked it out. I had to make some phone calls, and God worked it out. But in God's providence, He put it all together. And my car's still not running, but Lynn's car's fine, and it's all working. But I mean, people at times when things like that happen start freaking out, and their confidence in God's character and what God's going to do and how God's going to take care of things fails. And they start praying for weird things. You know? And what they really should be praying for is just to align themselves with God's will. And that's where Esther began. She began with praying to align herself with God's will. That God, in His faithfulness, is going to deliver His people. And that if she's the person to help bring that about, then she's going to bring it about. And give her the wisdom to do it. And preparing this meal was effort. This was her effort. This is her way. You know, it's been 30 days since she's seen the king. I mean, what's the first thing you would do? Here's what you think. You're going to bust down the door. You're going to go into the king's throne room because, you're the queen. And you're going to demand that the king deal with Haman for what Haman's doing, right? That's not really trusting in God. That's you taking matters into your own hands. You haven't seen him in 30 days. And okay, all right, I want to trust that God's going to give me what I want by being angry and going in there and demanding things. Oh, no. Why? So what she does is she invites him to her home. She finds that he is, or to her room, and she finds that he is enamored by her, that he is respecting her, that he finds favor in her sight. So he invites her, she invites him, and to come and have a nice meal. And what do you do at meals? Sit and you talk. You enjoy one another's company. So she invites him. But she already believes that God is going to bring the king to the chamber with her. Because the meal's already prepared. And look, in verse 5. See, this is how I also know that the meal is prepared. Because in verse 5, the king responds. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly." See that? Bring Haman quickly. Food's ready. It's hot. Get Haman, let's get in there, and let's enjoy a dinner together with my wife. Bring Haman quickly that we may do as Esther desires. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. She put some work into this. When it comes to faith, when it comes to confident faith, when it comes to believing that God's in charge, believing that God is working, and then actually acting on it and knowing that He's going to bring about His providence and His good, it takes effort. And sometimes it takes, Abraham. He's a great example of this. Abraham. God comes to Abraham and tells Abraham, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. From you, you're going to have many nations. Remember, he's very old. He's past childbearing years. Well, he's not, but his wife is past childbearing years, but he's really, he can't get the job done either. But, well, actually, he can at the time that he says this. It's later on that he can't. But anyway, because God calls him, tells him you're going to have a kid. Sarah doesn't think she can have a kid. And what does Sarah do? Here's Hagar. And Abraham says, okay. Well, that's not God's promise. See, that's negative effort. That's believing that God is going to do what he says he's going to do, but not having the confidence that God has the power to do it in the way that God said he's going to do it. Eventually, finally, they do have a child together, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac. And when Isaac's about 12 years old, God comes to Abraham and says, that's a precious son you have there, your only son. You and Sarah are not having another one. So I want you to take him up to Mount Moriah, and I want you to sacrifice him for me. Here's the positive effort in the faith. Here's the confidence that Abraham had. He didn't turn around and say to God, really, does it have to be him? No. He says, okay, Lord. And he takes him, and he walks him right up that mountain. And as he walks him up that mountain, you know what he does? He has his son carry the firewood that he's going to use for the burnt offering, which is going to be him, Isaac. Isaac carries his own wood up the mountain. And Abraham gets up to the top of that mountain. And even at the top of the mountain, he's looking at his son. And I don't know how in the world his son did this, but he tied his son up, put him down, got the knife, very ready to sacrifice his own son. This is effort. This is positive effort. But as he was going up that mountain, what did his son ask him? Well, we got the wood, but where's the sacrifice? What does Abraham say? God will provide. And just as Abraham's about to slit his son's throat, angel stops him, looks over in a thicket, and he sees a ram. And there's a sacrifice. All of that was a test for Abraham's faith. That he confidently trusted that God, not knowing how God was going to do it, but confidently trusted that God could bring his son back. Because as he's going up the mountain, he says to his servants, my son and I will be back. That's faith. And that's confident faith. And that confident faith demonstrated effort. Another incredible example is King David. King David. Now, I need to say this about King David because of the effort that he put in. See, sometimes when it comes to our confident faith, sometimes the effort that we have to put in is no effort at all. Because God calls David to be the king of Israel. And as God calls David to be the king of Israel, guess what? There's already a king sitting on a throne. A man by the name of Saul. And Saul knows that David is going to be king. That God has anointed him king. And David actually lives in the palace with him. He plays the harp for Saul. See, God brings an evil spirit on him, and Saul kind of freaks out, and when David plays the harp, it calms him down. Until finally it doesn't calm him down enough, his jealousy winds up causing him to throw a spear at David, and David runs off. And David spends years running away from Saul. But wait, David is supposed to be king, right? Now he's being chased down by Saul. And he's one of my heroes in Scripture in the respect to the fact that he knew God had called him to something. But he also knew that God had called Saul into the same position. And he had the opportunity twice to kill Saul. Twice. Not once, but twice. And both times, he was close. One time he went into the encampment and he stopped one of his servants from actually sticking a spear in Saul's face while he was sleeping. The other time was in a cave. While Saul goes into the cave, there was no bathrooms at the time, so that's what he's in the cave for. And while he's in there, David is right behind him. You know how close David was to him? He reached up, grabbed the hem of his robe, cut it. And then when Saul left, he went out and he said, Saul, I could have killed you. That's how close he was. But see, David trusts God. David has confidence that God is going to put David on the throne. But David is not going to push God's providence. He's going to allow God to do it himself. And he kept saying, who am I to take the life of the Lord's anointed? The one who God has chosen to be king. That is not my position. It's not my place. It's God's. To the point that when Saul was he was killed in battle. When Saul was killed in battle, someone else, not the person who killed him, but someone else came to David and thinking he was going to get high honors and high respect for taking credit for killing Saul, comes to David and said, I killed Saul. I killed Saul. And David turned to him and said, really? Wow. So you come to me and you tell me you killed the Lord's anointed. Who gave you the right to kill the Lord's anointed? You want a reward? Here's your reward. Kill him. And that man was killed. That's how much David respected God's choosing. And he trusted that God was going to put him there. And God did. And he didn't push the envelope. Sometimes that's what effort is knowing that God is going to do it, and you hold back, and you let God do it. Esther had effort. She knew and she trusted that God was going to bring about his plan. She knew very well that God was going to do it. She didn't know how. She didn't even know really if this was going to work. She didn't. But she figured it's her best shot. So now here we have verse 6. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, oh, by the way, when they're drinking their wine, the point there is the meal is over. They're just sitting around drinking wine at this point. So they sat around drinking their wine. That's kind of like their dessert. And the king said to Esther, what is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it shall be done. This is the second time he's asked her those same exact words. He really wants to know what's going on in Esther's heart. He really wants to know what the deal is. He's genuine. He's probably literally eating out of the palm of her hand at this moment. She's got him. Perfect opportunity to spring it on him, right? All right, I got him. He's ready. Now he's getting all happy with his wine, and he's, I fed him all these grapes, and he's all full and ready to give me what I want. I'm about to turn Haman right over to him, right? So that's what she does. She says in verse 8, if I have found favor, or she says in verse 7, I'm sorry, my petition and my request is, and she stops. She stops. She's about to speak. And we don't know why. Nobody has a clue why. besides the fact that I believe it was just God moving her, and she patiently changes it. Instead of saying, my request is, Haman is a horrible man, he wants my people dead. That's not her request. She figures, wait a minute. Verse 8, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king says. Sometimes you don't need to push the envelope. God is going to do what God's going to do. And what we need to do when it comes to faith, and when it comes to confident faith, an incredible marker of that is patience. We need to have patience in God and in what God is doing. I don't think it was Esther's intention of waiting. I don't think it was Esther's intention of allowing it to go one more day. I think that came on her in the spur of the moment. And if you know the rest of this story, as it unfolds, waiting one more day, as we're going to see next week, is actually going to cause the threat of Mordecai's life to come even faster. But I say threat. Because it gives God the I don't want to say the opportunity, it gives us the opportunity to watch God work when we're patient with what God is doing. When we trust that God is in control, that God is promised to never leave us and never forsake us, when He has promised to watch over us, when He has promised that we can be secure in who He is. And we're patiently watching Him work. We see His plan unfold even more. Because it becomes even worse for Haman. Haman winds up hanging himself on his own gallows. I think this is where it comes from. Because he does wind up hanging himself on his own gallows. And I believe that happens because of God's providential work in Esther's life to help her hold back on making the request at this very moment. We need to be patient. Isn't that really a huge drawback when it comes to faith? We know God's in control. We know it. We know we can trust God. We can be confident in what He's doing. But God, can't you do it a little bit faster? Isn't that what we think? Isn't that what goes through our heads? Being a pastor, being a preacher, being church planter, whatever the role, it's not. It really is not something that you just wake up one morning and say, yeah, you know what, this is what I want to do. It really isn't. This isn't being a mason, where I just go in and I just learn how to lay block. This isn't being a cashier at Walmart. This is a calling. It's not a job. It's not a career. It's not something that a person goes into so that they can just make a lot of money and get a lot of popularity. It's not what this is about. And if that's what somebody thinks, then don't be a pastor because you're in it for the wrong reason. It's a calling. And it takes a lot of patience, trusting in God to work through all of that. And it takes a lot of patience because there's a lot of schooling. And I keep saying this, if you want to be used in ministry, you're going to be marked up. In order to actually grow and learn in your faith, in order to strengthen in your faith, well, guess what? What does James say? Consider all joy, my brother, when you encounter various trials. Because the testing of your faith does what? Produces endurance. It strengthens you. All of that takes patience. Because you don't know what God's going to do. Planting a church takes patience. Because you don't know what God's going to do tomorrow. You don't know who God's going to bring in. You don't know who God's going to take away. You don't know where you're going to be meeting. You don't. You don't know if the dog's going to bark like crazy. It takes a lot of patience and trusting that God is going to do it. Esther is demonstrating serious, confident faith. Got the marks there. Her effort, her courage, her patience. What about you? How's your faith? Do you trust not only that God has everything under control, but know that he's going to see it through? You know, it's easy to say, yeah, I believe God, I trust God. It's easy to say that. It's very easy to say, I've got faith in Jesus. I've got faith in God. I've got faith he's got it under control. But do you actually know? Can you say, I know he's going to see me through? And is that shown by your courage? Do you take a stand for the promises that God has made in your own life? Do you put effort into glorifying him and working through this plan? Not making his providence work, but leaning into his providence. And sometimes that effort may be backing up and letting God work, because sometimes people like to do it all themselves. Know the difference. Are you working to honor him, or are you working to honor you? And it really shows in your patience. See, your patience, when it runs thin, you start pushing yourself because you don't want to wait on God anymore. But if you actually are patient, you're going to wait on God. Doesn't mean you're going to just sit on your hands. You'll continue with the effort. You're going to wait on God. Maybe that effort is restraining yourself. Esther had something difficult that she had to do that demonstrated this confident faith. There's something in your life that's going on right now that is testing whether or not you have confident faith. Do you have those markers? Do you have courage that God's in control, even though you may be shaking? Putting effort into it? Yeah, man, that effort could just be prayer. You're being patient with God. Those are the marks. Can you check them off? If not, why? Father, you're awesome. You're in control. And we're grateful that we can trust you. We're grateful that we can live our lives knowing, not knowing what's going to happen, but knowing, Father, that you are going to bring about your glory in it. And we're grateful, Father, for the fact that we have an opportunity in our lives each and every day to show others confident faith and to bring you glory. Father, you know we live in crazy times. I think sometimes it's just takes courage just to walk out the door in the morning. But we know that we can lean on you. And we know that you're in control. So we want to ask, Lord, that you would strengthen our faith, and that our resolve and our confidence would always be in you. Not in ourselves, not in this world, not in the government, but in you and your promises. And we are so grateful that the one promise that you have made us is that you will never leave us or forsake us, that you are with us until the end of the age. And we thank you for that. And help us to always be mindful of your work in our lives. And we ask this all in your Son's glorious, perfect, and righteous name.